Thank you for being here. My name is Philip Hain. I'm currently serve as the Executive Vice President of Temple Sinai of Glendale, where my family has belonged for 25 years. Temple Sinai is honored to be the host for today's program. And we've been hosting a Jewish Book Festival event for many years. We're proud of our partnership with the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys to bring the larger Jewish community together for these educational programs. I want to start by thanking the Temple Sinai of Glendale Board of Directors, clergy, and staff for their support in having the event here. Those responsible for coordinating the many details that brought everything together are Flo Cohen, Ruth Devine, Susan Hain, Jacob Barr, and Dianju Aguilar. Also, the wonderful treats you've enjoyed were made possible by the combined culinary efforts of our Temple Sinai Sisterhood, plus Carol Cornell, Ruth Goldstein, myself, Ruth Devine, and Kathleen Richland. I would like to say that I have read the book and am very excited to hear its backstory and other details of how the story came to be written. And now I would like to introduce Denise Schaefer, representing the Jewish Book Festival, who will do some final thank yous.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you again to Temple Sinai. You all were an absolute pleasure to work with. Welcome to our 24th annual Jewish Book Festival. We're so excited that you're joining us today. The festival is sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valley. And with us today is our Executive Director, Jason Moss. And I want to ask him to make a few words of welcome as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited that we're able to hold this very special Jewish Book Festival, One Book, One Community event here at Temple Sinai of Glendale. As you may know, the Jewish Federation of the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys is a resource for everything Jewish in the Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. We are a safe place for people to find their way into and connect with both their Judaism and the Jewish community. The programs and services like our Jewish Book Festival celebrate Jewish community and create opportunities for people to engage with the beauty and richness of Jewish culture. And we are the Jewish voice for our local community, the eyes and ears who serve to locally educate and promote Judaism and Jewish life. Our 24th annual Jewish Book Festival does not happen overnight. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment to create this festival each year. So before we start our program, I'd like to acknowledge all the people involved. Thank you to our hardworking committee members and our chair, Linda Mazer, our Jewish Federation Program and Community Outreach Coordinator, Rebecca Russell, our advanced readers, the Jewish Book Council of New York, our behind-the-scene tech wizards, Jake Tavel and his incredible team, and of course, a very special thank you to our Literary Circle members, whose financial support make the entire festival possible. I'd like to also welcome representatives from our Jewish Federation Board of Governors. Thank you for the time and energy you put into our community, as well as all the hard work you do for all of us. So thank you all for being here. Look forward to today's event, and I hand it back over to Denise.
Okay, so as Jason mentioned, this is our first One Book, One Community. And I've talked to so many of you, and I am so excited that many of you already read the book. So hoping for a great conversation and take advantage of our author being with us today. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our author, Jai Chakrabarti. Jai, I knew that. Jai was born in Kolkata, India, and now lives in the Hudson Valley in New York. He has always had a lifelong passion for writing poetry before extending into short fiction and then his first novel. He received his MFA from Brooklyn College, then an emerging writer fellow at a public space in New York. His short fiction has appeared in numerous journals and anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories and was awarded a Pushcart Prize. A Play for the End of the World is his first novel and won the 2021 Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Crossing time, geography, and cultures, his novel knits together a play, The Post Office, by Bengali writer and 1913 Pulitzer Prize winner, Rabindranath Tagore. Yeah, okay, good. With the 1942 Warsaw Ghetto and 1972 rural India during a government protest. Jai has a personal and fascinating perspective. So let's hear from our author. Welcome, Jai.
The writing process for this novel involved many revisions over many years. This is my first novel, so I had no idea how to write a novel, and I was figuring it out along the way. This is a story about two people who fall in love despite the history of their traumas and despite all of the counter forces that are conspiring to pull them apart. And it's the story of how they figure out how to navigate those tensions and whether it makes sense for them to be in partnership. This is also a historical novel, and it's a story about a play that was performed in an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, and how that play then gets performed 30 years later in a village in India, and how the performance of that play ends up changing the lives of villagers who are fighting for their lives, who are fighting for their right to land. You know, art doesn't just exist in one way. It doesn't just exist solely to save us, but you know, it has all of these hidden rooms, and I wanted to live in those rooms through India and Poland.
This is Gopalpur, the professor said. This is where they will perform your play. This time Yarrick didn't bother to correct the professor that it wasn't his play. He was looking at the goats tethered to a barn, at a lonely cow that grazed the field. Next to the huts, there were rows of gardens. In the center was a well. A boy drew water, the squeak of the pulley against the hinge, like a long-lost melody. For a moment, he tried to imagine her here with him, making a hut of their own.
I think in earlier versions, I had perhaps more of a writerly agenda of what I wanted the characters to do or where I wanted the book to go. And I think that the revision process, what I've learned, is a kind of letting go of that writerly intention. And it is a kind of deepening or immersion into connecting with the characters and seeing, you know, more of how they might see the story of what they might want to do. So that was a deep education for me. You know, there's a scene with the rabbi and Yarrick sort of later in the novel, and he's thinking about, well, what is the question that he really wants to ask if he's going to go and get counsel from the wise rabbi. And you know, he asks a series of questions, and he realizes the question that he really wants to ask is this question of, after everything, am I capable of love. So I was really interested in exploring this idea of love almost as like an act of resistance. I hope that readers have their own experience with this novel. And, part of the process for me has been that letting go, and knowing that each reader will have their own very distinct story that they're bringing to the novel, their own set of experiences. And I'm so looking forward to connecting with people and hearing how they are thinking about these characters and what resonated with them and what didn't. And yeah, that's something I'm really looking forward to.
Wonderful. So I am going to start by talking about the genesis story behind this novel, how it came to be. And then I'm going to talk about the history of it in Poland, as well as the history in India at the time. And then I'm going to end with a short reading. But to talk about the genesis story, I have to go back to my own genesis, which is my birth. I was born in Kolkata, India, which makes New York City look a little bit like a village. I can see there's some people who've been to Kolkata here. And I went to a school that's actually in the Guinness Book of World Records for this unusual distinction of the most number of students in a school with 15,500 students. And I was telling Denise earlier that there were typically 50 some students in every classroom. And you can just imagine what recess was like. Talk about a good time. So despite the number of students in this school, there was a lot of focus on the arts. Arts education was really important in the school. It's called South Point. And from an early age, we were taught poetry. We, in fact, performed plays. And when I was about the age that my son is now, he's 7, I was involved in the production of a play called The Post Office. The Post Office is written by the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, Rabindranath Tagore. You did excellent pronouncing his name, Denise. And, I knew about Tagore. Every child who's grown up in India, who's gone to school in Kolkata, as I did, if you wake us up in the middle of the night, we can recite a Tagore poem, no problems. But I didn't know how this play had traveled across the world. And many years later, when I was living in Jerusalem, I re-encountered this play from my youth. So how did I end up in Jerusalem, you wonder? So New York City, which is where I've spent most of my adult life, I think one of the magical parts of New York City is that it brings people of all kinds of faiths and backgrounds and nationalities together. And so that's where I met my now wife, the poet Ilana Bell. We met in a poetry community. We're still each other's first editors. And Ilana is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Her mom was born in Israel, and her grandmother was from Łódź and was liberated from Auschwitz. So a few years before we got married, Ilana had a travel grant, and we ended up living in Jerusalem for quite a few months at that point. And it was our last day in the city. It was a gray and rainy day, and we did not want to go out. We just wanted to stay inside and be cozy. But it was important for both of us, and especially Alana, to visit Yad Vashem, given her history. And it was there at Yad Vashem at an exhibit called Art in the Ghettos that I would encounter this play, The Post Office, once more. And I would learn the story of Janusz Korczak, and I'm going to tell you more about him in a moment, and how Dr. Janusz Korczak ran an orphanage in Warsaw and decided, of all things, to stage a Bengali play with his children in July of 1942. So July 18th of 1942 is a particularly difficult time in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Great Deportations begin in August. So this is literally weeks before he and his children would be rounded up, and much of Jewish Warsaw would be sent to the trains. And yet he decides to stage a play. And I was incredibly moved that art would be what anyone would turn to in this time, but that it would be a piece of art that was from my childhood, from this, gigantic school where I had a small ragtag part in the production. I was absolutely moved, and it changed the course of my life, to put it very simply. Until then, I'd written poetry, I'd written and published short fiction as well, but I had no prior interest in writing a historical novel. But when I saw the confluence of these stories, I knew that I wanted to get deeper into it. And so one of the reasons why I went to Brooklyn College is because I got to study with some scholars of the Warsaw Ghetto while I was also getting my degree, my MFA in creative writing at the same time. And it was there that I started to learn more about the history of that time. And from there, the seed of the novel came to be. And I'm going to start to present a few slides now, just so you get a few visuals along with hearing the sound of my voice so you don't completely fall asleep. All right. Okay. Yay, the tech is working perfectly. Thank you, Jacob and Jake. Hallelujah. Never happens like this. Okay, so starting with Janusz Korczak. So I am privileged to talk about Janusz Korczak today and to tell those of you who may not know about his story a little bit more about him. So Janusz Korczak was born as Henryk Goldschmidt to a secular Jewish family. He was born in 1878 or 1879. There's some confusion about his birth date because his dad did not submit his birth certificate on time. And he was a true Renaissance figure. So he was trained as a physician, and he served as a military doctor, including in World War I, where he was actually on the field. But his deepest passion was children and children's education. So Janusz Korczak wrote children's books. There's two of them that are published in English. One is called King Mat I. The other is called Starry the Wizard. It's a little bit like a Harry Potter type of book. I was talking to somebody earlier about Harry Potter. I feel like J.K. Rowling owes Janusz Korczak a little bit of credit there. And beyond writing children's books, he also ran this orphanage on Krochmalna Lane. So for those of you who may be familiar with the work of Isaac Bashevis Singer, one of my influences when it comes to the short story. So Singer lived on Krochmalna Lane. It was one of these storied, beautiful streets in Warsaw. And that's where Dr. Korczak started his orphanage. And he had this idea that children should be listened to, that they were full autonomous human beings from the start, that they were wise beyond measure, that adults could learn a lot just by listening to children. He was a contemporary of a certain figure whom you may be more familiar with in the world of education. And I'll just show her picture 1 second here. Do any of you recognize who that is on the screen? So the character on the right is my son. I would be surprised if you recognized him. He's the 7-year-old astronaut, but the person on the left is Maria Montessori. And Montessori and Korczak ran in the same circles. So they knew each other, and I would say also in some ways independently began to create this radical pedagogy. Now, the reason why I have my son's picture on this screen as well, in addition to the fact that it also brings me happiness, is that when my son started 2nd grade at the beginning of this year, in his class, he came up with, what does he call it? A classroom agreement. So the kids collectively made up rules on how they wanted the class to work. And if any of them violated those rules, they also came up with consequences, right? This is now fairly commonplace in America in child-centered schools. Apparently, this was not this kind of school I went to, so it's all new for me. But if you look at this idea of a children's agreement, you can trace that back very directly to the work of Janusz Korczak. You can trace that back as well to Montessori. That's where this child-centered learning comes about. In his orphanage, Dr. Korczak had the children not only come up with laws, but they could establish their own council. So they decided what the consequences were, not only for the kids, but also for adults. So they had an incredible amount of autonomy. And he was a great believer in preparing children for whatever was to come, including the darker things. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to acknowledge, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. I want to acknowledge Madame Stefa here, who is also in the novel. And Madame Stefa was his right-hand person. She helped develop this important pedagogy that is with us today. So when it comes to this idea of preparation, there's something Janusz Korczak talks about when he's needing to give all the kids their vaccine shots, their immunizations. And of course, he thinks the kids are not going to like this. So he's thinking about the scaffolding that he needs to provide. So first, he explains what is going to happen, what needs to happen. Then he has them write about it. He has every child in his orphanage keep a journal, including dream journals, so they can write about the process before they actually experience it. Then he's there with them for the immunization itself. So this is scaffolding, right? So for those of us who have some exposure to teaching pedagogy, you see like the layers in which he's presenting this so that they can be comfortable even in a difficult moment. So this brings me back to this question of this play, The Post Office, and why Janusz Korczak chose that particular play in July of 1942. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One reason, of course, is that any kind of performance brings people together. He was intent on printing out flyers and inviting as many people and squeezing as many people as he could into the great room of the orphanage. And this play, which is about India, allowed kids to imagine a faraway land. So in Janusz Korczak's diary, you have him describing children who are making up costumes, imagining what it's like to be in India, which is really this other planet for them. And then the third reason is about the subject matter of the play itself. And the play itself is about a young boy by the name of Amal, who has some kind of mysterious illness that keeps him quarantined. Now, having lived through the last couple of years, I think we can all appreciate what it means to be quarantined. And this child, he can't leave his house because the doctors are afraid if he goes out, his condition is going to get worse. So he interacts with children through his window. Some people come to visit him. They tell him stories. And what he has is the faculty of his imagination. And what he finds is that through his imagination, he can create extraordinary worlds, and he can retreat into those worlds as long as he wants to. And that becomes for him an extraordinary gift. Even though, as the play wears on, it becomes clear that this disease, this illness that the child has, is not curable, that he is heading towards death. And so, what more difficult preparation for a teacher than to prepare his students, his children, for that journey? And Janusz Korczak and Madame Steffa, on August 6, 1942, despite the fact that they were well known, especially Korczak himself, he had a very famous radio show, for example. And despite the fact that there were many invitations for them to leave, they both chose to stay with their children. And so that's part of their legacy, as is all of the love that came before. And that's, of course, just as important. So I talked about the fact that for Janusz Korczak, community was important, and I want to show you a couple of more images. So here is Władysław Szpilman. Does anybody recognize Szpilman? Do you know who the? Okay, who is he? Oh. Okay, we have a relation in the house. Yes. Yes, he was the subject of the film The Pianist. In the movie, he is played by Adrian Brody. So Szpilman was a good friend of Korczak's, and the night of the performance of The Post Office on July 18th, 1942, you can find Szpilman playing a nocturne by Chopin. And for those of you who may have read the novel, you'll know that Jarek has a favorite composer, and that composer is, in fact, Chopin. And the reason for that is because of this connection to Szpilman. Szpilman was an extraordinary pianist, world-renowned, but he was particularly famous for playing those nocturnes. And if you've read the memoir or seen the movie, you'll know of that scene where he's playing music to basically save his life, and he's playing Chopin's Nocturne number 10. Keep going back to my kid. That's the wrong direction. Okay, and the great Warsaw poet Władysław Szlengel, so he wrote these words: "It transcends the test being a mirror of the self. It transcends emotion, being experience. It transcends acting, being the work of children. So these words were put onto flyers and distributed all over the ghetto. And this was part of the invitation. And you can find these words as part of the Emanuel Ringelblum archive. We owe a great debt to Emanuel Ringelblum, who was also a school teacher. And early on, after the German occupation, Ringelblum decided to catalog as much as he could. And he kept around recipes for coffee cake. He kept around newspaper clippings. He kept around literary journals. He buried them all under his house in a location that nobody really knew, except a few people knew. And one of the folks who knew about the location of the Ringelblum archive was somebody who escaped the train heading to Treblinka. So this novel is about this historical event that happens in Warsaw in 1942. But the front story largely happens in New York in 1970s, and then in India in that same time period as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the history in India, which some of you may be perhaps a little less familiar with. But first, a pop quiz. So clearly that is Rabindranath Tagore, but who is that on the left? Okay, I must say it's an audience of Einstein's. And who is that on the right? Yes, that's right. So Tagore was an extraordinary titan of letters. I perhaps can be described as the Shakespeare of Bengali, in that he wrote poems, plays, novels, short stories. The national anthem of Bangladesh and of India are composed by Rabindranath Tagore. He was extraordinarily prolific, and he hung out with Einstein, which, in fact, side note, but their conversations are recorded, and you can actually look at the conversations of Tagore and Einstein, where Tagore takes the position of the humanist and Einstein the scientist, and they have these really wonderful debates. And he was also very politically involved. So the last great fast of Mahatma Gandhi was broken by Rabindranath Tagore in this small, intimate moment where Tagore brings Gandhi a glass of orange juice. So India has been shaped by the work of Rabindranath Tagore, and this play and so many of his other works have traveled the world. As part of the research for this novel, I came across a Yiddish songbook that was popular in the 1930s in Warsaw, and found a song, Farvus, which means why, something like that. And it's actually a translation of a Tagore poem. So Tagore was well known in Warsaw at the time. And when I started researching this book, I had this view that, oh my gosh, this is so long before the internet, before commercial airline travel. How could ideas go from India all the way to Poland? And of course, that's not true. There was an incredible amount of cultural exchange happening at the time. So this is an image of protesters in 1971, Dhaka in Bangladesh. And the conflict for Bangladesh to become its own country was one of the bloodiest and most terrible conflicts in recent history. So this was in the 1970, 1971. The government of Bangladesh estimates that 3 million people lost their lives during this time. which would make it the second largest genocide, which would make it the largest genocide since the Holocaust. And it was about kicking out Hindus, and it was about kicking out people who were not ethnically the same as the larger country of Pakistan. So in 1971, Bangladesh becomes its own country, and you have waves of refugees who are crossing over the border into India, many of them fleeing religious persecution. In fact, my maternal grandparents are refugees who fled, like many people did, with just the clothes on their back. And this is the environment that Yarick is coming into. He's not terribly familiar with the history or the politics of the time, but you have this creation of Bangladesh as a country. You also have in India the sowing of a lot of discontent, which begins in 1967 with an event called the Naxalite Revolution, which is a small uprising that starts in the village of Naxalbari and then starts to spread through the cities and threatens to take down the whole entire government. So when the main character of my novel, Yarick, he's been invited to India to perform this play again 30 years later. When he arrives, he's unaware of these political tensions. But what he soon discovers is that there are villagers who could use his help in the same way in which Janusz Korczak once provided a sense of protection toward his children. He thinks he can do the same now for the villagers that he encounters. And I want to talk a little bit about the themes of the book. I describe this novel as a love story in 3 dimensions. One is that it's a romantic love story between Yarick, the survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto, and Lucy, a woman from the American South. Lucy knows very little about Yarick's past. Like many survivors, he chooses to keep that history to himself. In my wife's family, Zosha, who was from Łódź and was liberated from Auschwitz, only started talking about her history when Steven Spielberg's team came around and did interviews. And I think this is a very common experience among survivors. And Yarick is no different. So Lucy doesn't understand the degree of trauma that he's carrying around. So there's that core love story between the two of them. Then there's a familial love story between Yarick and Misha. Misha is very different from Yarick. He is also from Janusz Korczak's orphanage, but he's a little older. He's garrulous. He's social. He wants to build community. He wants to talk about that time. He's a bit of an anomaly in that way. And it's his death that precipitates Yarick's traveling to India. And so the two of them, this brotherly love and the sense of duty that Yarick feels towards Misha, are another engine that moves the novel forward. And the third love story is this inheritance of love from Janusz Korczak, or Pandokter as he's called, toward his children, and how being in that environment, being part of the situation at 92 Krochmalna Lane, gives Yarick a sense that he must act, that he must do good in the world when he's presented with the opportunity. So those are kind of the 3 themes. And I realize I've been talking for a moment, and I'm going to share a couple of brighter slides here, or just one brighter slide. So on the left is a temple from Kolkata, the city of my birth. It's a beautiful temple. And on the right is the famous synagogue from Cochin, which is in southern India. And as I was telling my friends over lunch today, the Jewish folks who migrated to Cochin, they left with artifacts from the second temple in their possession, if it gives you a sense of how old that community was. And it was an important trading partner, an autonomous state, in fact, so much so that if you can see those tiles, they're made of marble with lapis lazuli. They were given by the one and only Kublai Khan because it was such an important trading partner and he wanted them to be happy. And can I read a short section or should we go into Q&A? Okay. Great. So I'm going to read from the chapter 60 Miles East, which is where Yarrick is escaping from the train. Sometime between living and dying, the train again stopped. It was the moment Yarrick remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. Some memories were like that, bolted and nailed to the mind's eye. You could try to change them, shape them into something they weren't, but you would always be the boy with trousers that reached his ankles, the boy with the tweed cap found by Misha and given special, and the train was stopped now. Who knows whether for a moment or for a longer time, and the guards were shouting because he thought someone ahead had jumped. He was holding Chaim's hand, who he knew didn't have the heart to move an inch, and the heat had already burned, and he had already cried, and Pan Doctor could do nothing because he was just breathing. He thought, jump. But the rifles had colored the air outside with smoke. Still, he could see it. The window was big enough not only for a cat, but also for him. If only he jumped and squeezed through. Except the train had started to move again. The screams had died down. The soldiers had stopped firing. He looked at Pan Doctor, and Pan Doctor winked the way he did whenever a mischief had been made, but no one was going to be told, because love was that kind of secret keeping. The train had started moving again, but he saw the sun through the window that was big enough just for him. And what spirit launched his body? What ghost slid him forward? Because it was not his 9-year-old bones that did. Still, it happened. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders. He pulled himself up. He went headfirst, and someone he'd never know who pushed his body through the gap. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no soldier heard. For a while, he watched the train pass, expecting others to have followed, but no one else did. Not another soul had jumped on another boy's shoulders and been pushed into the fields. Was he simply the skinniest, the fastest, or just the most daring of them in that car, the one most willing to leave the others? Now he was alone again in the field of damp and moss. He heard water nearby, and he thought of Pan Doctor's face. So much hope, his knees bloody with it, his left wrist bruised dark. So much hope in the wet grass under his palms that when the train gnarled away, the old trees called and he crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment he remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. He heard the first gunshot, saw the two officers turn away, rushed to Pandokter's side, who was breathing so heavily, his whole chest breathed with the effort. Yarrick pointed to the window, whispered, "We can squeeze through that." Pandokter said, "Not all of us can." He looked again, not the darkness, but the light of the waiting. He couldn't tell if Pandokter would be afraid. Still, it happened. With one held breath, he jumped on Hein's shoulders and squeezed through. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no soldier heard. Sometime between living and dying, it was the moment. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another. Some memories were like that, as stiff as Madame Steffa, who refused to sit the whole time. She stood, she guarded the window. On the back of the first gunshot, he bolted, but her legs were like a guillotine. How could he pass through? "If we all don't go, you don't go," she said, as if he should have known. He remained by her knees to love your brother, but he had not stolen, he had not thieved. Sometime between living, dying, it was the moment, 30 years, he hadn't, when Pandokter removed his spectacles and lolled, "Not all of us can, but you can." Pandokter was the one who lifted him up, and Yarrick squeezed through the back of the first gunshot, crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees, his knees bloody with the memory of his old teacher, with no spectacles, winking at that too bright light. For he had been chosen, he had been reborn. Thank you.
Hold on a second. That was beautiful. I'm still like catching my breath from that story and weaving that background for us. It felt like your book to write. We want to give you all an opportunity to answer some questions, ask some questions. If you are virtual, you can type them in the Q&A tab. The chat is disabled and we'll monitor the questions. And for those of you in the room, just raise your hand and I'll come around with a microphone and we'll have time to ask our author. We'll start here.
Very interesting. Does your book cover the refugees that went into India during the war of West Pakistan and East Pakistan? It's my recollection that there were millions of refugees that went from East Pakistan into India.
Yes, so the country now known as Bangladesh used to be known as one of those Pakistans, as you say. So in the novel, there is a village of people who cross over the border during that war and flee to India, which was a very common experience for many people, including my grandparents. So that is part of the story of this novel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the amazing experience of your book. What surprised you about your characters when you re-edited and they had a life of their own? What surprised you?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. So my process for writing in general is that I don't put an outline. I don't know where I'm going. Like E.L. Doctorow says, I'm sort of driving in the fog. And the process that I adopted was from Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, where she has people free write, except I would free write in my characters' voices. So I have probably hundreds of pages in Yarick's voice, in Lucy's voice. In fact, in Mrs. Paul's voice, earlier versions of this novel have long sections that are just Mrs. Paul. And I would say, like, what surprised me the most is getting to know these people. And even today, it's been a minute since I finished. I feel like I could have dinner with them and they still feel very close to my heart. And I'd written a lot of short stories before this. And I think the way I would describe the difference between short stories and novels, they're both relationships. You have relationships with your characters, but with a novel, it's like you're stranded on a desert island with your characters. So it's just a deeper level of intimacy. And I was surprised by how deeply I still feel them in my body today. Thank you.
You have a character who helps the protagonist in Poland, but also beats him. Is there any on anything, or is that a fiction of your imagination?
So it's not premised on a specific historical event, but from the histories of folks who did manage to escape and spent their time in the woods. Some of them were taken in by what we might describe as good Samaritans. Others were taken in by people we might describe as not so good Samaritans. And I think it was probably a mix-up of some of those not so good Samaritan stories.
Your book was beautiful on so many fronts. There's a little delay here. And I'm wondering, you talk so richly about Janusz Korczak being a teacher and the leader of this orphanage, and you speak kind of like a teacher. Have you ever thought about being a teacher as well as a writer, or do you teach?
Oh, thank you. I teach creative writing here and there, and literature, but it's one of my 20 jobs, as it were. Thank you. Denise, you're getting a workout.
Hi. She's getting her steps in. A couple of the characters that you didn't touch upon are really vivid and so richly drawn. One, the professor who puts on the revival of the play, and his servants and his milieu, and is that based on any historic character, or is that solely your imagination?
Yeah, that was inspired. The professor was inspired by a historical figure. And I'm going to try to answer this briefly, but you've touched a question that's important for me that I should have covered probably. But so it's based on the character of Safdar Hashmi, loosely based, I should say, on the character of Safdar Hashmi. Hashmi was a playwright who performed plays in the streets of India, like Delhi. One of his first plays, it's called Machine, was attended by 200,000 union workers. So he wrote plays to try and uplift the lives of workers, people who were struggling in factories. 10 years after he performed that play, He was assassinated by thugs hired by the Indian government in the middle of performing another play by the name of Halla Bol. His wife, Maulai Shri Hashmi, the next day, while he was in hospital, where he was going to die of tragic injuries, would complete the performance of that play. So for folks who think that perhaps art hasn't had an impact in social change, I offer the story of Safdar Hashmi, but he was certainly an influence as I thought about the professor. It's not to say they're at all a one-to-one correspondence, they're not. But the fact that he was able to start this profound history of street theater that's still very alive in India. And of course, in this country, we have Bread and Puppet. There's so many examples across the world. That was important for me.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask one more question. On a lighter note, I just was in love with the family of the taxi driver, and that was beautiful. And so I was wondering what the inspiration was for those characters.
I don't know if I have a direct answer to that, other than I was raised by strong middle-aged Indian women, and Mrs. Paul is an example of that. And as I mentioned, she used to have a much larger part in the novel. But something that Michael Cunningham used to always tell us is that every minor character you have in your book, they are a major character in another novel. So treat them right.
Okay, I'm going to go over here, but I do have a couple questions from the chat. Can you talk more about your revision process? What did you do after writing your first draft?
After writing my first draft, I thought, oh my God, what a mess. There's no way this can be a novel. This is just absolutely crazy town. And then so the other part of my background is, like most good first generation immigrants, I have a degree in the sciences. I'm a trained computer scientist. And so I started to map out every single section and identified every theme, every character interaction. And after about 10 years, I got to something reasonable.
So after I finished the book, really enjoy it, really loving it, and then read the notes, I didn't realize that Janusz Korczak was a real person, and was kind of curious. I think you mentioned how you came to know him, but is he fairly well known outside of Poland? Because I'd never heard of him before.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so for me, I really get to enjoy sharing the story of Janusz Korczak with folks. He's fairly well known in Israel. I think, for folks who grew up in Israel, I would be shocked if they didn't know about Janusz Korczak in some way or form. I think he's less known in America. He's, I think people who do know him know of him only through that one event where he's accompanying his children to the embarkation point, and it's this poignant, important moment in Holocaust history. But he was such an incredible figure and had such a broader life beyond that I like to talk a little bit about. And for those who are interested in reading a little bit more, there's a wonderful biography by Betty Jean Lifton called The King of Children that I recommend.
One of the questions from the chat, wondering if any of the children in the school survived the war.
So there are children from Janusz Korczak's orphanage who survived, but none of the children who were there at the time, so there was 192 children and a few staff, are known to have survived. So the stories we have of Janusz Korczak are from children who had kind of graduated beforehand.
Another question?
This is not a question, it's a request. I really want to know what happens to Lucy and Yorick's child. So please, will you write the story, what happens to a child of these two parents but that heritage that that child will carry.
Well, I think we should take a poll and just, you know, so one of the things that I believe in is the 2-beat ending, which is the writer supplies 1 beat and then the reader supplies the final beat. And the beat from the reader is probably more important because I think, you know, as readers, we've constructed the worlds ourselves. So whatever you think happens to Lucy, I think that's right. But I will say, I mean, I don't want it to be a total cop out. I will say that I am deeply optimistic about love. And so if there's anything that can heal trauma, I think it is, you know, the covenant of a relationship. And while I think their relationship is not going to be easy, I think it's going to be quite complicated and it's going to be 1 step forward, 2 steps back sometimes. I do think that they stay together, but that's just my, you know, that's just my sappy self. So there are lots of people who don't agree with me and that's fine.
Great. Well, I'll end it with a comment from the chat to tell you how amazing and moving your presentation was. And thank you.
Thank you all so much.
So just a couple announcements before you have an opportunity to purchase one of Jai's books and have him sign it. So the book's available to purchase. And for those of you on Zoom, the book can be purchased at your local bookstore or on Amazon via the Federation link that's in the chat. If you'd like a signed book plate, we will have Jai sign some, so call the Federation office and we'll send it out for your book. Finally, a preview of our next 2, our actually last 2 book. Yeah, 2 books for our upcoming events. So next Saturday, December 10th at 7:30, David Cypress will discuss his memoir, What's So Funny, a cartoonist memoir. As the longtime staff cartoonist for The New Yorker, he will be sharing personal stories from his memoir, including his creative inspirations and some of his witty, beloved cartoons. And our final event, December 13th at 7:30, is our rescheduled Zoom with Martin Indyk, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He'll be discussing his book, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. And both books are available today as well in advance. And there's time to register for both events on the website. So thank you again for joining us. Please enjoy the beautiful dessert reception from Temple Sinai, and thank you again.